Charismatic leader Pastor James Kendrick had served the congregation for 15 years, building a reputation as a devoted family man and spiritual guide who had transformed a dwindling parish into a thriving community center. But on March 7, 2023, the sanctity of this community cornerstone was shattered when the body of 34-year-old Morgan Riley, a beloved member of the church choir, was discovered in the rehearsal room, lying in a pool of blood. The brutality of the crime, multiple stab wounds to the chest and neck, shocked the tight-knit community. More shocking still was the arrest, just 5 days later, of Pastor Kendrick himself. What followed was the unraveling of a complex web of secrets, deception, and forbidden desire that had been hidden behind the carefully constructed facade of religious devotion. The investigation would reveal not only a clandestine affair between the pastor and choir member, but also the desperate measures taken to preserve a public image when threatened with exposure. This is the story of how a respected religious leader's double life led to murder in a house of worship, forever changing a community that had placed its trust in a man who preached righteousness while harboring the darkest of secrets. Morgan Riley had moved to Oak Ridge 4 years earlier, seeking a fresh start in a place where nobody knew their history. At 30, Morgan had completed gender transition and was hoping to build a life where they could simply be accepted as their authentic self. Initially, Morgan had been hesitant to join any religious organization, fearing rejection or judgment. But the First Baptist Church, under Pastor Kendrick's leadership, had publicly embraced messages of inclusivity and acceptance, even if some of the older congregation members remained traditional in their views. With a master's degree in music education, Morgan quickly found work teaching piano and voice at the local community college. Their exceptional soprano voice and musical training made them a natural addition to the church choir, where they were welcomed by most members, though not without some whispered conversations behind closed doors. Those who knew Morgan described them as kind, patient, and private. Few knew much about their past before Oak Ridge, only that they had grown up somewhere in the Pacific Northwest and had become estranged from their family during early adulthood. Morgan lived alone in a small apartment above the town's bookstore, volunteered at the local animal shelter on weekends, and seemed to find their greatest joy in music. Morgan had this way of singing that made listeners feel as though they were telling their own story through the hymns. The emotion in their voice touched people, even those who might have had reservations about Morgan's identity. When they sang, those doubts seemed to disappear. What most people in Oak Ridge didn't know was that Morgan had been keeping journals since childhood, documenting their journey of self-discovery, transition, and the struggles and triumphs that came with living authentically. These journals, which would later become crucial evidence, revealed a person of deep reflection and emotional intelligence who had overcome significant obstacles to find peace within themselves. The journals also revealed that in the months leading up to their death, that peace had been disrupted by a complicated relationship that was causing Morgan increasing distress. James Kendrick, 47, had built his reputation as the model of Christian leadership. Tall, handsome, with prematurely silver hair that only added to his authoritative presence, Pastor Kendrick had the rare ability to make everyone feel personally connected to him. His sermons blended traditional biblical teachings with modern relevance, and under his guidance, the church had grown from a congregation of 150 to over 600 members. Married for 22 years to his college sweetheart Rebecca, with whom he had 3 children, Kendrick presented the image of the perfect family man. His oldest daughter was attending seminary, following in her father's footsteps, while his twin sons were high school athletes being recruited by prestigious colleges. Kendrick had intentionally positioned his church as more progressive than many of the other religious institutions in the region. He spoke about acceptance and love, even as he maintained certain traditional theological positions. This delicate balancing act had allowed the church to attract younger members without alienating the older conservative base. Behind this carefully crafted public persona, however, James Kendrick harbored struggles that he revealed to no one. According to later psychological evaluations and personal writings found on his computer, he had long experienced attraction to both men and women, something he had suppressed through years of prayer and self-discipline. His journals revealed a man tormented by what he perceived as his own weakness and hypocrisy. Pastor Kendrick had built his life and career on a foundation of moral authority. The thought of losing that foundation terrified him more than anything else. The first interaction between Pastor Kendrick and Morgan Riley occurred during choir auditions in September 2019. According to church records and testimony from other choir members, Kendrick had not typically attended these auditions in previous years. His presence that day was unusual, ostensibly to welcome new members to the ministry. From the beginning, witnesses noted Kendrick's particular attention to Morgan. He began attending choir practices with increasing frequency over the following months, often offering personal guidance and encouragement to Morgan in particular. What appeared to be mentorship gradually evolved into something more intimate. Church administrative records showed numerous instances where Pastor Kendrick and Morgan were alone together in the church, outside of normal operating hours. Email exchanges recovered from both their accounts revealed a deepening emotional connection, carefully worded at first, but growing increasingly personal. By the summer of 2020, according to Morgan's journal entries, the relationship had become physical. The entries depicted Morgan's conflicting emotions, elation at finding connection with someone who seemed to truly see and accept them, mixed with guilt over the pastor's marital status and fear of discovery. For nearly 2 years, the affair continued in secret. They met in the church office after hours, in Morgan's apartment when neighbors were away, and occasionally in neighboring towns where they were less likely to be recognized. The pastor's schedule, often filled with counseling sessions, hospital visits, and community outreach, provided ample cover for unexplained absences. Morgan's journals revealed that by late 2022, the nature of their relationship had begun to shift. While Kendrick had initially seemed genuinely interested in understanding Morgan's experiences as a transgender person, expressing what appeared to be sincere acceptance, his private behavior started to change. He became increasingly concerned about appearances, sometimes refusing to acknowledge Morgan in public settings and expressing worry about what others might think if they were seen together too often, especially given that Morgan transitioned into current gender, an act frowned upon by the community. According to recovered text messages and Morgan's journal entries from February 2023, the relationship reached a breaking point. Morgan had grown tired of secrecy and what they perceived as Kendrick's shame. An entry dated February 12, 2023 revealed that Morgan had given the pastor an ultimatum: either acknowledge their relationship and begin the process of coming clean to his wife and the church leaders, or Morgan would end the relationship entirely. The pastor's response, as documented in Morgan's journal, was a mixture of panic and pleading. He asked for more time, insisted that he needed to find the right way to approach such a revelation, and emphasized the damage that would be done to his family and the church community. For 3 weeks, the tension escalated. Morgan began missing choir practices, citing illness. When they did attend, witnesses later described noticeable tension between them and the pastor. Church secretary later told investigators that she had overheard what sounded like an argument coming from the pastor's office after a Wednesday evening service, though she couldn't make out the words. On March 1st, Morgan wrote what would be their final journal entry, a decision to give the pastor one last week to begin addressing the situation, after which they would not only end the relationship, but would also inform the church elders about the pastor's pattern of deception. The entry concluded with Morgan expressing regret at the pain this would cause, but affirming their belief that continuing the deception was causing more harm than good. The evening of March 6th was unseasonably cold in Oak Ridge. A late winter storm had brought freezing rain, keeping most residents indoors. The church was largely empty, with a finance committee meeting ending around 7:30 p.m. Security camera footage from a neighboring business showed Morgan's blue Honda Civic pulling into the church parking lot at 8:17 p.m. According to the pastor's initial statement to police, he had not been at the church that evening. He claimed to have been at home with his wife, watching television after dinner. This alibi was initially corroborated by Rebecca Kendrick. However, cell phone tower data placed Kendrick's phone near the church between 8 p.m. and 9:45 p.m. Additionally, despite the pastor's claim that he had not driven anywhere that night, his SUV was captured on a gas station security camera 3 blocks from the church at 9:52 p.m. The medical examiner determined that Morgan Riley died between 8:30 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. on March 6th. The cause of death was multiple stab wounds, 17 in total to the chest, neck, and face. The ferocity of the attack indicated rage rather than a calculated killing. Defensive wounds on Morgan's hands and forearms showed they had tried to fight off their attacker. The murder weapon, a letter opener from the pastor's desk, was found wrapped in a choir robe and hidden in a ventilation duct in the church basement. DNA testing would later confirm the presence of both Morgan's and Pastor Kendrick's DNA on the handle. The body was discovered the following morning by the church custodian, who immediately called 911. First responders described a scene of extreme violence, with blood spatter covering the rehearsal room's piano, sheet music, and walls. Oak Ridge Police Department led the investigation. The initial focus was on canvassing the neighborhood and interviewing church members to establish a timeline and potential motive. Several choir members mentioned the noticeable tension between Morgan and Pastor Kendrick in recent weeks. The church secretary's report of an overheard argument added to the emerging picture. However, no one suspected the true nature of their relationship. The breakthrough came when investigators seized and examined Morgan's computer and journals. The detailed accounts of the affair, along with saved emails and text messages, provided a clear motive for the crime. Simultaneously, technical evidence was mounting against the pastor: his cell phone location data, fibers from his clothing found at the scene, and a witness who reported seeing his SUV near the church around the time of the murder. When confronted with the discrepancies in his alibi, Rebecca Kendrick broke down and admitted that her husband had asked her to lie. He had left the house around 7:30 p.m., claiming he needed to return to the church to retrieve some sermon notes, and hadn't returned until after 10 p.m. When he came home, she noticed he had changed his clothes and appeared agitated. The search of the Kendrick home yielded further evidence. A bloody shirt was found hidden in the garage, and internet search history on the pastor's personal laptop showed queries about cleaning blood from clothing and destroying DNA evidence in the hours after the murder. On March 12th, 5 days after Morgan's body was discovered, Pastor James Kendrick was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. For 2 days following his arrest, Kendrick maintained his innocence, claiming he was being framed. His attorney, prominent defense lawyer Martin Schaefer, issued public statements questioning the integrity of the evidence and suggesting that the police were rushing to judgment. However, when presented with the overwhelming physical evidence and excerpts from Morgan's journals detailing their relationship, Kendrick's resolve crumbled. In a recorded interview on March 14th, he confessed to the killing, though he claimed it had not been premeditated. According to his confession, he had indeed met Morgan at the church that night to discuss their ultimatum. The conversation had quickly escalated. Morgan had been adamant about no longer living in secrecy and threatened to expose their relationship to the church elders the following Sunday if Kendrick didn't take steps to address the situation himself. In what he described as a moment of panic and rage, Kendrick had grabbed the letter opener from his desk and attacked Morgan. Once he realized what he had done, he attempted to clean up the scene, hiding the murder weapon and disposing of his bloody clothing upon returning home. The confession painted a picture of a man who had lived in fear of exposure for years, not just of the affair but of his sexual identity. The prospect of losing everything, his family, his career, his reputation, had triggered a violent response that he claimed he immediately regretted. Psychological evaluations conducted after his arrest described Kendrick as suffering from severe anxiety and depression, exacerbated by years of internal conflict between his religious beliefs and his sexuality. However, experts stopped short of suggesting these conditions absolved him of responsibility for his actions. The revelation of Pastor Kendrick's double life and his confession to murder sent shockwaves through Oak Ridge. The tight-knit community struggled to reconcile the spiritual leader they had trusted with the man who had committed such a violent act. The First Baptist Church held a memorial service for Morgan Riley, attended by hundreds from the community, including many who had never known them personally. Former students from the community college shared stories of Morgan's kindness and patience as a teacher. Fellow choir members performed Morgan's favorite hymns in tribute. At the same time, the church faced a crisis of faith and leadership. Attendance dropped dramatically in the weeks following the murder. Some members couldn't bear to enter the building where the crime had occurred. Others felt betrayed by a pastor who had preached honesty and integrity while living a lie. The church elders issued a formal apology to the community and to Morgan's friends, acknowledging that they had missed warning signs and failed in their oversight responsibilities. They also announced plans to establish a music scholarship in Morgan's name at the community college and to implement new policies aimed at preventing abuse of power within the church hierarchy. For Oak Ridge's LGBTQ community, the tragedy highlighted the dangerous consequences of religious environments that forced people to hide their true selves. Local advocacy groups organized support meetings for those affected by the crime, particularly focusing on LGBTQ individuals who had been part of religious communities. Rebecca Kendrick filed for divorce shortly after her husband's confession. She and her children moved out of Oak Ridge, seeking anonymity and a chance to rebuild their lives away from the shadow of James Kendrick's actions. The trial of Pastor James Kendrick began in September 2023, 6 months after the murder. Despite his confession, Kendrick pleaded not guilty, with his defense team arguing diminished capacity due to extreme emotional distress. The prosecution presented a methodical case, emphasizing the element of premeditation. They pointed to Kendrick's attempts to establish an alibi, his cleaning of the crime scene, and his hiding of evidence as indicators that the crime was not a momentary lapse of judgment, but a calculated act. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from church members, psychological experts, and forensic specialists. Morgan's journals were entered into evidence, with selected passages read aloud in court, giving voice to the victim's perspective, even in death. Rebecca Kendrick testified for the prosecution, describing her husband's increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to the murder and his explicit request that she lie about his whereabouts on the night of March 6th. In his own testimony, Kendrick expressed remorse but maintained that he had never intended to kill Morgan. He described a lifetime of struggling with his sexuality within the confines of conservative religious expectations and the fear that drove him to maintain his heterosexual marriage despite his attraction to men. His relationship with Morgan, he claimed, had been the first time he had acted on his true feelings, creating both profound connection and devastating guilt. The jury deliberated for just 7 hours before returning a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. The lack of a first-degree conviction suggested they accepted that the killing had not been planned in advance, but rejected the diminished capacity defense. On October 18, 2023, Judge Caroline Hurst sentenced James Kendrick to 25 years in prison, noting that his position of trust and authority made his crime particularly egregious. In the year following the trial, Oak Ridge slowly began to heal. The First Baptist Church, after months of reduced attendance, appointed a new pastor who focused his early sermons on themes of honesty, acceptance, and the dangers of judgment. Morgan Riley's journals were published in part with proceeds going to transgender youth support organizations. Their story became a powerful example of the human cost of religious intolerance and the dangers of forcing people to hide their authentic selves. James Kendrick, incarcerated at Eastern State Correctional Facility, declined all interview requests from media. According to prison officials, he participated in counseling programs and religious services, keeping largely to himself. Rebecca Kendrick and her children established new lives in another state. In her only public statement following the trial, released through her attorney, she expressed her deepest sympathies to those who had loved Morgan and asked for privacy as her family attempted to process their own sense of betrayal and loss. The rehearsal room where the murder occurred was eventually renovated and repurposed as a community outreach center, named in Morgan's memory. A small plaque beside the door bears a simple inscription, "In remembrance of Morgan Riley, whose voice reminded us of the beauty that comes from living authentically." The case of Pastor James Kendrick and Morgan Riley is more than a story of murder and deception. It is a tragedy born from the impossible contradictions some religious communities create for their members, particularly those who identify as LGBTQ. Kendrick's crime cannot be excused or justified. The brutal taking of Morgan's life represents the ultimate betrayal of the trust placed in him as both a religious leader and a partner. Yet the circumstances that led to that fatal confrontation, years of suppressed identity, fear of rejection, and the pressure to maintain a perfect public image, reflect broader societal issues that continue to damage countless lives. Morgan Riley had found the courage to live openly as their authentic self, despite the challenges they faced. Their journals reveal someone who had fought hard for self-acceptance and who ultimately was unwilling to return to the shadows of secrecy. In this respect, their life, though cut short, stands as a testament to the importance of personal truth. The ripples from this tragedy continue to spread through Oak Ridge and beyond. Religious communities across the region have begun more open conversations about inclusion and the damage caused by forcing people to hide core aspects of their identity. Support groups for religious LGBTQ individuals have reported increased attendance as people seek ways to reconcile their faith with their authentic selves. For the residents of Oak Ridge, the white steeple of the First Baptist Church still pierces the sky, visible from almost anywhere in town. But now it stands as a more complex symbol, a reminder of both the comfort of community and the dangers of secrets kept in the name of appearances. The true lesson of the tragedy, perhaps, is that genuine faith must make room for human authenticity in all its forms, or risk becoming a prison rather than a sanctuary. In the end, 2 lives were destroyed that March night, Morgan Riley's by violence, and James Kendrick's by his own inability to reconcile his public persona with his private truth. The tragedy serves as a sobering reminder that the most dangerous prisons are often those we build ourselves, one deception at a time, until the walls become too high to escape without destruction. On April 17, 2022, In a shocking scene, a fisherman found washed ashore the body of Eliza Martinez, 29, a lifelong resident of Millfield County and, until recently, a beloved member of the New Covenant Fellowship Church. The initial assumption of accidental drowning was quickly dispelled when the medical examiner noted ligature marks on the wrists and ankles, indicating that Eliza had been bound before entering the water. By noon, the area had been transformed into a crime scene. The victim was identified as Eliza Martinez, 29, a lifelong resident of Millfield County and, until recently, a beloved member of the New Covenant Fellowship Church. The initial assumption of accidental drowning was quickly dispelled when the medical examiner noted ligature marks on the wrists and ankles, indicating that Eliza had been bound before entering the water. 2 days later, in a development that stunned the tight-knit religious community, Pastor Theodore Ted Wilson, 58, the charismatic leader of New Covenant Fellowship for over 20 years, was taken into custody. The charge: first-degree murder of the young woman who had recently begun her gender transition, a process that had created ripples of controversy throughout the congregation. What had begun as a spiritual leader's concern for a church member's soul had transformed into a lethal manifestation of religious fanaticism, a tragic endpoint to a relationship that had once been built on mentorship and communal faith. With approximately 400 regular attendees in a county of 8,500, the church wielded significant social influence in the community. Under Pastor Wilson's leadership, New Covenant had developed a reputation for blending traditional evangelical Christian values with a warm, family-oriented atmosphere. Wilson, who had arrived in 1999 after leading a smaller congregation in a neighboring state, was known for his powerful sermons, his community outreach initiatives, and his personal involvement in church members' lives. He and his wife, Margaret, had raised 3 children in the parsonage beside the church, all of whom had followed their father into various forms of ministry across the country. The church maintained a careful balance between tradition and accessibility, holding firmly to conservative theological positions while presenting them in ways that emphasized love and community rather than judgment. This approach had allowed the congregation to maintain its numbers even as religious participation declined nationally, particularly among younger generations. Yet beneath this veneer of inclusive traditionalism lay certain immovable boundaries of belief, lines that, when crossed, revealed the limits of the church's touted acceptance. Gender and sexuality remained areas where New Covenant stood firmly with conservative interpretations of Scripture, a position that had rarely been directly challenged until Eliza Martinez began her transition. Born Diego Martinez to Manuel and Sofia Martinez in 1992, Eliza had grown up in Millfield County as part of a family that had lived in the area for 3 generations. The Martinez family ran a successful local restaurant serving authentic Mexican cuisine that had become something of an institution in the small community. As Diego, Eliza had been an active member of New Covenant Fellowship from childhood, participating in youth groups, mission trips, and eventually teaching Sunday school for elementary-aged children. Those who knew her during these years described a kind, somewhat reserved person who seemed deeply committed to their faith, but also increasingly troubled by an inner conflict they couldn't articulate. After graduating from the local high school, Diego had attended a Christian college 3 hours away, majoring in education. Upon returning to Millfield County, Diego began teaching 3rd grade at Millfield Elementary School, where students and parents alike praised his patience and creativity. Throughout these years, according to journals later found in Eliza's apartment, she had been struggling with gender dysphoria, feeling a profound disconnect between her assigned gender and her true identity. These private writings revealed years of prayer, attempted self-discipline, and increasing desperation as she tried to reconcile her emerging identity with the religious framework that had defined her life. In September 2021, at age 28, Diego began the process of transition, first coming out to close friends and immediate family. By January 2022, she had legally changed her name to Eliza and had begun hormone therapy. According to those close to her, the decision to transition openly had come after years of inner turmoil and several episodes of severe depression, including one suicide attempt that had been kept private from the broader community. The Martinez family, while initially shocked, had ultimately embraced Eliza's transition. Manuel and Sofia Martinez later told investigators that seeing their child's relief and emerging happiness after beginning transition had convinced them that supporting Eliza was the only loving response possible, regardless of their initial religious reservations. New Covenant Fellowship, however, proved less accommodating. Theodore Wilson had not grown up in a religious household. According to his memoir, published in 2015 to mark his 15th anniversary at New Covenant, he had experienced a dramatic conversion at age 22 after what he described as a period of destructive behavior and moral emptiness. This personal transformation had driven him to attend seminary and eventually pursue leadership within evangelical churches, known for their emphasis on personal salvation and moral rectitude. By all accounts, Pastor Wilson had been genuinely committed to serving his congregation and community. Under his leadership, New Covenant had established a food pantry that served hundreds of families monthly, partnered with local schools for after-school programs, and raised funds for various community improvement projects. His charismatic preaching style and apparent sincerity had earned him respect beyond church membership, including among local government officials and business leaders. Wilson had also cultivated a reputation as someone willing to work directly with church members facing spiritual crises. He frequently invited troubled parishioners to his office for prayer sessions, conducted home visits during times of illness or family crisis, and maintained ongoing mentoring relationships with various church members, seeking guidance. It was in this pastoral capacity that Wilson had first become deeply involved in Eliza Martinez's life. According to church records and later testimony, Diego Martinez had approached Pastor Wilson in 2018, seeking spiritual guidance for what was described in Wilson's notes as confusion about identity and purpose. These counseling sessions had continued sporadically for 3 years, increasing in frequency in the months before Eliza began her transition. What these sessions contained remains largely unknown, as Pastor Wilson claimed pastoral privilege regarding their specific content. However, excerpts from Eliza's journals suggest that she had been honest about her gender dysphoria and had initially hoped that, through prayer and pastoral guidance, she might find a way to resolve her inner conflict while remaining within the church's theological framework. Friends of Eliza later recalled that she had initially spoken positively about these sessions, believing that Pastor Wilson was listening empathetically. Over time, however, her perspective had shifted, with increasing frustration noted in her journal entries about what she perceived as the pastor's inability to separate theological doctrine from compassionate human response. When Eliza formally began her transition in fall 2021, her relationship with Pastor Wilson and the broader church community rapidly deteriorated. According to church members, Wilson had initially responded with calls for prayer and expressions of concern, rather than outright condemnation. In a sermon delivered in October 2021, without naming Eliza specifically, he had spoken about the church's obligation to love those who struggle while maintaining biblical truth. By December 2021, however, the pastoral approach had hardened. In private meetings with church leadership, documented in minutes later subpoenaed by investigators, Wilson had described Eliza's transition as a direct assault on God's created order and spiritual rebellion of the highest order. He had pressed for formal church discipline, a process that could ultimately result in excommunication if the member refused to repent of perceived sin. Eliza, still hoping to maintain her spiritual home, had continued attending services despite increasingly uncomfortable interactions. Several church members later reported witnessing heated exchanges between Eliza and Pastor Wilson following Sunday services. One such incident in February 2022 had resulted in Eliza leaving the church in tears after Wilson had publicly refused to use her chosen name and pronouns during a prayer group. Text messages recovered from Eliza's phone revealed escalating pressure from Wilson, including biblical citations related to abomination and divine judgment, accompanied by assertions that he was merely concerned for her eternal soul. These messages, increasing in frequency and intensity through March 2022, demonstrated Wilson's growing fixation on what he termed Eliza's spiritual peril. Particularly troubling were references to water baptism as cleansing and washing away sin, themes that would later take on sinister significance given the manner of Eliza's death. In one message sent 3 weeks before her murder, Wilson had written, "Sometimes God's cleansing requires full immersion in his judgment before rebirth can occur." By early April, Eliza had stopped attending New Covenant entirely and had begun visiting an affirming congregation in a neighboring county. According to her final journal entries, she had felt both grief at leaving her spiritual home and relief at finding a community that accepted her authentic self. She had written about her hope to eventually reconcile her faith tradition with her identity, perhaps serving as a bridge between seemingly opposed worlds. On April 15, 2022, 2 days before her death, Surveillance cameras at Millfield Elementary School captured footage of Pastor Wilson waiting in the parking lot after school hours. Witnesses reported seeing him approach Eliza as she left the building, resulting in what appeared to be an intense conversation that ended with Eliza reluctantly getting into Wilson's SUV. This would be the last time Eliza Martinez was seen alive by anyone other than her killer. The timeline reconstructed by investigators indicates that Pastor Wilson drove Eliza to the church following their encounter at the school. A church administrative assistant later confirmed seeing Eliza enter Wilson's office around 4:30 p.m. on April 15, noting that she had appeared distressed. The administrative assistant left at her usual time of 5 p.m., at which point both Wilson and Eliza were still in the pastor's office with the door closed. What transpired during the next several hours remains unclear. Wilson's subsequent confession provided some details, though investigators believe he minimized certain aspects of the encounter. According to Wilson, he had arranged the meeting to make one final appeal to Eliza to turn from her path. The conversation had allegedly lasted several hours, growing increasingly heated as Eliza refused to accept Wilson's interpretation of scripture regarding gender. By Wilson's account, as evening approached, he had suggested they pray together one last time, including what he described as a recommitment ceremony at the river where New Covenant traditionally conducted baptisms. This location, a secluded spot approximately 2 miles upstream from the Millfield Bridge, was accessible via a private church-owned road and featured a small wooden platform extending slightly over the water. Cell phone tower data confirmed that both Wilson's and Eliza's phones had been in the vicinity of the baptism site around 8:15 p.m. A church deacon who lived nearby reported hearing a car drive toward the river around that time, but thought nothing of it, as the site was occasionally used for prayer meetings. The forensic evidence, however, contradicted key elements of Wilson's version of events. Analysis of fibers and DNA recovered from the pastor's SUV indicated signs of struggle. Rope fibers matching those found on Eliza's wrists and ankles were discovered in the vehicle's trunk, suggesting she had been restrained before arriving at the river rather than going willingly, as Wilson claimed. The autopsy revealed that Eliza had suffered a concussion shortly before entering the water, likely rendering her semi-conscious during the cleansing ritual Wilson described. Water in her lungs confirmed she had been alive when entering the river, drowning after being thrown from the baptism platform with her limbs bound, making escape impossible despite the relatively shallow water. Most damning were the texts sent from Wilson's phone to his wife at 9:27 p.m. Finished late counseling session, stopping to pray at the river, don't wait up. This message, sent after Eliza was already dead, suggested premeditation rather than a spontaneous act of religious fervor. In the early hours of April 16, security cameras at a gas station 15 miles from Millfield captured footage of Wilson's SUV. The pastor, appearing disheveled and agitated, had purchased cleaning supplies and a change of clothes. Upon returning home around 2 a.m., he had told his wife he had experienced car trouble after his counseling session and prayer time. For nearly 48 hours, as the community reacted with shock to the discovery of Eliza's body, Pastor Wilson continued his normal activities, including leading Sunday services on April 17, just hours after her body had been found. Attendees later recalled that he had spoken movingly about tragic accidents and God's mysterious ways, even leading the congregation in prayer for the Martinez family without mentioning his role in their loss. The investigation into Eliza Martinez's death began as a suspected drowning, but quickly evolved into a homicide inquiry when the medical examiner noted the ligature marks and head injury. Millfield County Sheriff's Department led the investigation, beginning with a meticulous examination of Eliza's recent interactions and potential conflicts. The Martinez family immediately identified the escalating tension with Pastor Wilson and New Covenant Fellowship as a significant concern in Eliza's life. A review of her phone records, emails, and journal entries confirmed increasingly troubling interactions with Wilson, providing investigators with their first strong lead. When questioned initially on April 18, Pastor Wilson expressed appropriate shock and sadness, but claimed to have had only limited recent contact with Eliza, describing their last interaction as a brief, civil conversation following a chance encounter at the local grocery store 2 weeks earlier. He provided a detailed account of his activities on April 15 and 16, claiming to have been engaged in sermon preparation, a counseling session with an unnamed church member, citing pastoral confidentiality, and prayer time alone at the river baptism site. This narrative began to unravel when detectives obtained security footage from Millfield Elementary showing Wilson and Eliza leaving together on the afternoon of the 15th. When confronted with this evidence during a follow-up interview, Wilson modified his story, acknowledging the meeting but insisting it had been brief and had ended with Eliza leaving the church around 6 p.m. The breakthrough came when forensic analysis of Wilson's SUV revealed traces of Eliza's blood on the rear cargo area carpet, despite evidence of recent cleaning. Additionally, rope fibers matching those found on the victim were discovered in the vehicle. A search warrant executed at Wilson's home uncovered a receipt for cleaning supplies purchased at 1:14 a.m. on April 16, and a bag of wet clothing hidden in an outdoor shed containing traces of river sediment matching samples from the baptism site. Faced with mounting physical evidence, Wilson was arrested on April 19th. During a 6-hour interrogation, after initially maintaining his innocence, he provided a partial confession, acknowledging his responsibility for Eliza's death while framing it as an accident during a spiritual intervention rather than intentional murder. According to his statement, he had become increasingly concerned about Eliza's spiritual destruction and had felt divinely called to intervene more forcefully after conventional pastoral counsel had failed. He described the events at the river as a cleansing ritual that had gone wrong when Eliza had allegedly struggled and fallen from the platform. This version of events contradicted the physical evidence, particularly the binding of Eliza's limbs and the head injury sustained before entering the water. When pressed on these discrepancies, Wilson eventually acknowledged that he had restrained Eliza for her own safety and that she had struck her head during an earlier struggle in his office, but continued to insist that he had not intended her death. Based on the physical evidence and Wilson's partial confession, the district attorney charged him with first-degree murder, specifically citing evidence of premeditation in his preparation of restraints, the isolated location, and his subsequent attempts to establish an alibi and destroy evidence. The revelation of Pastor Wilson's arrest sent shockwaves through Millfield County. The community's response reflected deep divisions in attitudes toward both transgender identity and religious authority. The Martinez family received an outpouring of support, with hundreds attending a candlelight vigil held outside their restaurant 3 days after Wilson's arrest. Her mother spoke briefly at this gathering, describing Eliza as finally becoming her true self and expressing devastation that her daughter's search for authenticity had been met with such violent rejection from a spiritual leader she had once trusted. New Covenant Fellowship entered a period of profound crisis. The church board immediately placed Wilson on administrative leave and issued a statement expressing shock at the allegations while calling for prayer for all involved. Church attendance dropped dramatically in the weeks following the arrest, with many members unable to reconcile their image of their spiritual leader with the crimes he was accused of committing. The congregation ultimately split into 3 distinct factions: those who maintained Wilson's innocence despite the evidence, viewing him as persecuted for standing firm on biblical principles; those who expressed horror at his actions while maintaining opposition to transgender identity on religious grounds; and those who began questioning the church's fundamental teachings on gender and sexuality in light of the tragedy. This third group, primarily younger members and families with LGBTQ connections, eventually left New Covenant entirely, many joining the affirming congregation Eliza had begun attending before her death. 6 months after Wilson's arrest, this exodus had reduced New Covenant's regular attendance by nearly 40%. The broader Millfield community similarly reflected divided responses. The local school board faced contentious meetings as some parents demanded policies explicitly protecting transgender students and staff, while others advocated for stricter adherence to traditional values. The county commissioners eventually passed a non-discrimination ordinance, though by the narrowest of margins and after heated public debate. Perhaps most significantly, several other transgender residents of Millfield County began speaking publicly about their experiences, many revealing that they had previously hidden their identities due to fear of precisely the kind of violent rejection Eliza had faced. A support group formed, named Eliza's Light, dedicated to creating safe spaces for LGBTQ individuals in rural religious communities. The Martinez family channeled their grief into advocacy, establishing a scholarship fund for LGBTQ education students and working with national organizations to develop resources specifically addressing the intersection of faith, culture, and gender identity in rural communities. Theodore Wilson's trial began in February 2023, 10 months after Eliza's death. The proceedings attracted national media attention, with the case being framed as emblematic of broader cultural conflicts around religious freedom, LGBTQ rights, and the potential for religious extremism to lead to violence. The prosecution presented a methodical case, emphasizing the physical evidence of premeditation and Wilson's escalating fixation on Eliza's transition. Text messages, church documents, and witness testimony established a pattern of increasing religious fanaticism, specifically directed at transgender identity. Particularly damaging was testimony from church administrative assistant Helen Graves, who described overhearing Wilson praying alone in his office 2 weeks before the murder, asking God to show me how to cleanse your church of this abomination, whatever it takes. She had assumed he was speaking metaphorically about spiritual matters rather than contemplating physical violence. The defense, while acknowledging Wilson's responsibility for Eliza's death, pursued a strategy focused on diminished capacity, arguing that Wilson's actions stemmed from mental illness manifesting as religious delusion rather than rational premeditation. They presented expert testimony suggesting that Wilson had developed increasingly paranoid and apocalyptic thinking patterns in the months leading up to the crime, fixating on what he perceived as existential threats to his faith community. Wilson's wife, Margaret, testified to his dramatically changing behavior, describing a man who had become obsessed with spiritual warfare and divine judgment, spending hours poring over obscure scriptural passages about cleansing and purification. She described finding him sleepless at night, pacing and praying in increasingly incoherent patterns, but noted that she had attributed these changes to work stress rather than mental illness. Wilson himself took the stand, appearing significantly thinner and more subdued than in pre-arrest photographs. He expressed remorse for Eliza's death, while continuing to frame his actions as motivated by genuine religious conviction and concern for her soul. His testimony revealed the extent to which he had convinced himself that a dramatic spiritual intervention was necessary to save Eliza, describing visions and what he believed were divine messages instructing him to conduct a cleansing ritual. When pressed by the prosecution about the specific preparations he had made, purchasing rope, selecting an isolated location, creating an alibi, Wilson struggled to reconcile these calculated actions with his claim of diminished capacity. Under cross-examination, he eventually acknowledged that he had known binding Eliza and throwing her into the river might result in her death, but insisted he had believed God would either save her through miraculous intervention or accept her death as necessary sacrifice for spiritual purification. After 7 days of testimony and 14 hours of deliberation, the jury rejected the diminished capacity defense, finding Wilson guilty of first-degree murder. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, the judge imposed the maximum penalty of life imprisonment without possibility of parole, citing the particular cruelty of exploiting spiritual authority to commit murder against a vulnerable individual. In his sentencing statement, the judge addressed Wilson directly. "You perverted the concept of religious guidance into justification for violence, twisting a faith meant to promote love into a weapon of hatred. In doing so, you not only took Eliza Martinez's life, but betrayed the very principles you claim to uphold." 2 years after Eliza Martinez's death, the ripple effects continued to transform Millfield County and beyond. New Covenant Fellowship, unable to recover from the exodus of members and the stigma associated with Wilson's crimes, eventually closed its doors in late 2020. The building was purchased by a community foundation and repurposed as a cultural center named in Eliza's memory, hosting educational programs focused on promoting understanding across different identities and beliefs. Theodore Wilson remains incarcerated at the state maximum security prison, where, according to correctional officials, he has established a small Bible study group with other inmates. He has declined all interview requests and, through his attorney, maintained that he acted according to his understanding of divine will, though he now acknowledges that this understanding was tragically flawed. Wilson's wife filed for divorce shortly after her husband's conviction and has since become an advocate for greater mental health awareness in religious communities, arguing that earlier intervention might have prevented her husband's descent into dangerous fanaticism. She has spoken at several national conferences about recognizing warning signs of extremist religious thinking and the importance of distinguishing between sincere faith and dangerous delusion. The Martinez family continues to operate their restaurant, which has become something of a pilgrimage site for LGBTQ individuals from surrounding rural communities seeking acceptance. The scholarship established in Eliza's name has supported 15 education students thus far, with recipients committed to creating inclusive classroom environments. The elementary school where Eliza taught has implemented comprehensive training on supporting transgender students and staff, a program now being replicated in several neighboring districts. Perhaps most significantly, Eliza's story has been documented in books, documentaries, and educational materials, transforming a personal tragedy into a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism and and the vital importance of accepting people for who they truly are. In April 2024, on the second anniversary of Eliza's death, over 500 people gathered at the Blackwater River for a memorial service. The spot where Pastor Wilson had attempted to cleanse Eliza of her identity has been transformed into a small contemplative garden, featuring a bench inscribed with words from her journal. True cleansing comes not from erasing who we are, but from embracing it fully in the light of love. The Blackwater River continues to flow, its current strong enough to reshape the landscape over time. In Millfield County, another kind of reshaping continues as well. The slow, sometimes painful transformation of a community learning that faith, at its best, should liberate rather than constrain, include rather than exclude, and above all, never become justification for harming those who differ from ourselves. For Eliza Martinez, whose journey to authentic selfhood was violently cut short, perhaps the greatest memorial lies in the changes her death has inspired, each representing another step toward a world where religious belief supports rather than threatens human flourishing in all its diverse expressions. For more interesting crime stories, check this one out.